All right. Good evening, everybody. Hi to everybody who is with us here in person and everybody online as well. My name is Lili Wilkinson and welcome to this Wheeler Centre session of Future You. I would like to start off by acknowledging that tonight's conversation is taking place on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present and to the elders of all communities that this conversation reaches. As a storyteller who is very proud and privileged to live on Wurundjeri land, I'd also like to pay my respects to all Aboriginal storytellers past, present and emerging. So my name is Lili Wilkinson. I am a young adult author. I live here in Melbourne and I am also the lead writer for a very exciting new government-funded initiative from the Office of Women in STEM, from the Ambassador of Women in STEM, called Future You, which we'll be talking about a little bit later. I'm also an academic. I have a PhD in creative writing from Melbourne University and do research into the ways in which literature can engage young people in activism and politics. I'm joined tonight by two real-life young people. It's very exciting. To my left, we have Charlotte, who is in Year 11 at Sunbury College, and we also have Zuva, who is a first-year uni student at Melbourne Uni studying arts. And we are going to have a bit of a chat tonight, but before we do any of that, I'm just going to say that I'm recovering from a bout of tonsillitis. It's not COVID. And I will be coughing throughout this thing because this cough will not go away. So I'm very sorry about that, but it will definitely happen. Anyway, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to have a little bit of a chat about the future. This particular event, this Teens Talk event, really centres young people and young people's voices and kind of reverses the teacher-student dynamic. So it is going to be we're going to be hearing for the young people and the teachers are going to be doing the listening, which is very exciting for me. And we are also going to be talking about our visions for the future, our fears for the future, our hopes for the future. And then I will tell you a little bit about the Future You project, and we will be joined online by the Ambassador for Women in STEM, Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that program. And then we will have a bit of time for Q&A, both with our online guests and our in-person guests. So please start thinking now of all of the very interesting and articulate questions you want to ask. And finally, before we get started, I will say that this conversation is presented by the Wheeler Centre, obviously, in partnership with the Future You program, which is an initiative of the Women in STEM Ambassador. So, welcome, Zuva and Charlotte.
Hi.
So let's start off with we're going to start off a little bit personal and then we're going to kind of broaden out a little bit as well. Where do you see yourself in the future in, say, 20 years' time? Charlotte, let's start with you.
Well, that's a really long time.
It is a long time. You could do 10 if you prefer.
It's fine. I guess I'm interested in like law and that sort of field, especially like human rights and things like that. But also I really love to write, especially like poetry and things like that. Mm-hmm. So I hope I'm doing something like that. I mean, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, that's all right. You definitely don't have to be sure. Because, yeah, who knows what the future is going to be like either. Like, you know, you often hear that thing that most of the careers that our high school students will end up in don't even exist yet, which is exciting and also terrifying, but also because of the way that the labour market has really changed over the last 50 years. The likelihood of either of you or me remaining in one job is quite unlikely. We tend to be a lot more fluid in our careers, which can be a scary thing and can be a bad thing because it doesn't necessarily lead to job security, but it can be an exciting thing as well because it gives us lots of opportunities to learn exciting new things. Zuva, where do you see yourself in the future?
Well, you basically took my response right out of my mouth.
Sorry.
I have no idea. But yeah, like you said, I think the future that we're walking towards is something that is completely unprecedented. I know that's everyone's favorite word. But yeah, there's just so much opportunity. And I think as a uni student, kind of taking my first steps into the workforce, I'm just realizing how fluid it's becoming. And I feel like as I've gotten older, I become less sure about what I want to do. I mean, if you had asked me this when I was like in middle school, I would have been like, oh, I'm going to be a lawyer. Like, you know, I had everything cut out. But yeah, I think the more that we kind of look at this ever-changing world that we're a part of, the more we realize that you don't have to be sure. And I think that's what allows us to be creative and kind of invent these new things that are going to help us progress forward.
And I think that's something that's really defining of your generation as well, is that real sort of fluidity with a lot of different aspects of your lives, your identities. I think that we are reaching a place where we are a lot less fixed in the way that we define things. We don't necessarily feel the need to put things in boxes so much, whether that is, you know, religion or sexuality or gender or lots of those different things. I think that we are becoming, hopefully, a lot more sort of fluid and I can't think of the right word, but a lot more accepting in lots and lots of different ways of being and existing, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I want you to imagine for a moment your ideal future, not necessarily your personal ideal future, although it can be that, but think about, you know, what kind of a future would you like to see for Australia, for the world, for you, for humanity? What do you reckon, Charlotte?
I guess I'd just like to see one where people are helped, like with climate change, people that are in power, they care about that. And especially with like the queer community, they're accepted, they're not. I think, yes, our generation has come forward a lot in terms of accepting the queer community and transgender people and different sexualities, but I also think it's often a misconception that anyone under the age of, say, 35 is accepting and they don't hold those prejudices, but I think they definitely still do, and it's still present in our society. So I guess a future I would like to see is one where we dismantle that and it's just a more accepting world.
Yeah, absolutely. Here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say the same thing. I think a future defined by unity is kind of my ideal future, and not just in like the individual sense and that we're like united in our communities, but on an institutional level as well, you know, one that kind of prioritizes these things, these intersections, you know, being queer, being different races, whatever it might be. I want a future where we're all kind of working together to make sure that we all feel included. And I think that kind of works in tandem with sustainability, because I think if we're united as a community, we'll be united in what we're trying to achieve in the world. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that a lot of the time, as we kind of strive to be better, there is a lot of discourse around, you know, there's a lot of policing of tone. I'm so sorry. I just wish it would go away. Around that kind of stuff. And whenever I kind of get embroiled in any of those kinds of discussions, I always try to think to myself, how will this argument, how will this discussion get us to where we want to be? You know, which is a more kinder and a more accepting kind of future. And I think that that's what I always try and help, you know, me drive conversations to try and get to that point and not driving people apart into different
I
things.
totally agree. I think a lot of modern discourse can be very polarized, and as great as the internet is, I think that does play a big role in it, where you kind of are in those echo chambers where you see your beliefs and your ideals kind of reflected amongst those who you talk to, so that when you get to this other side and start to have those conversations with the people who might not agree with you yet, you kind of see that friction and, like, you know, a lot of kind of emotion comes out, which I believe emotion definitely does have a place in this discourse. But yeah, being able to kind of sit down and when you're having those conversations, not trying to be right, but trying to be understood is so important. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what about the challenges? So what are the challenges that we face in getting to that, you know, to a better future for humanity?
Well, I think a lot of the time we just seem to forget how to treat other people. Like, we tell our kids and our children, oh yes, be kind, be thoughtful, care about others, help others. But then when it comes to much larger issues, we sort of throw that basic, like, moral thought out the window, and we sort of think this is too complex to have that. And I think that is true to an extent. We do need to consider a lot more factors, but I think that those still hold a role in those sort of discussions, and I think the people in power do need to consider those things. And instead of thinking about constantly, like, how to gain more, like, power, well, not really, just
Yeah, like power and influence and resources and...
I guess they're constantly just thinking of how to grow, whereas I think we need to nourish what we have as now, because it feels like we're just stretching and stretching our resources paper thin, and it's just not enough for our community.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think that sort of a lot of economic models are always kind of built around growth, and you know, you can only grow so much. Like there has to come a point where you reach a stability and maybe you start to focus on different things. What do you think, Zuva?
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds paradoxical, but in looking towards the future, we need to go back and revisit the past, because I think so many, well, almost all modern problems can be traced back to some point in the past. I mean, you think like colonialism and how that's had devastating effects on places all across the world. And like all of these issues that we kind of face, these prejudices all have their roots in these like historic sentiments. And if we want to progress and want to get that sense of unity, I think we need to acknowledge it. And it can be very uncomfortable, especially when in some capacity you may have benefited from those systems that have been so harmful and so detrimental. But it's so necessary, because if we just pretend like it never happened, then we kind of lose a way to grapple with the issues that we have now, and we don't like appropriately address them and figure out how to properly get rid of them. So
yeah, absolutely. So I reckon one of the biggest problems that we're facing is around climate change. Obviously, that this is, you know, a literally existential problem, and I think that as teens and as young people, it must be very frustrating. Teenagers obviously are, if you're under 18, politically disenfranchised. You can't vote. Which I think is, I mean, you would vote if I was the boss, but I think that is a huge amount of frustration among young people, and we can see that in the kind of climate protests, in the school strike for climate thing, all of this kind of incredible frustration that young people are seeing adults, you know, ruin the planet, and that there's nothing to be done. So tell me how that feels.
I guess it just makes me feel really angry and just, I guess, hopeless, because we know the issue. We know what climate change is doing to our planet. We know what is causing it, and yet there is not much being done about it. I mean, we just have to sit and watch the planet that we are going to have our future built on be destroyed by the people who don't have to deal with the consequences of what they're doing now.
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, I just think it's so unfair. I know a lot of kind of the conversation surrounding climate change and sustainability focuses on the individual, on like us young people, and, you know, these sustainable practices that we can do, shopping secondhand, you know, maybe eating plant-based or whatever it might be. But when you really think about it, there's only so much that we can do as individuals, and ultimately the change has to come from the institutions, because that's where the biggest influence is coming from. You know, me using a heater in winter is not having nearly the same effect as whole industries that kind of capitalize off of those like fossil fuels. And so I feel like it's just so annoying to, you know, feel like I'm trying to do all of this hard work as an individual, and yet watching all of these corporations, institutions just not care.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right there. And there is this sort of huge focus, and you see corporations being like, well, you know, you shouldn't be using a, you know, disposable plastic water bottle. You should be, you know, using a glass one. And it's like, yeah, but you like, just like, if it's in the UK, just pumped sewage onto the beaches. Or, you know, I think there is a great deal of hypocrisy going on there, and things like, you know, carbon credits, and there's all of this sort of carbon accounting that happens with corporations, where they're like, oh, we have a zero carbon footprint, and it's like, but you don't actually. You've just paid for someone else to plant some trees in a place, but that doesn't actually offset the carbon because it was already like a hunting lodge owned by some rich people. Anyway, I think that there is, a great deal of, I think that there is a lot of personal responsibility placed on individuals. And I don't think this is necessarily an individual problem. And I think that we spend a lot of time, I certainly spend a lot of time feeling guilty that I couldn't find a recycling bin. But that's not really the issue. I mean, it's great if you can do all of those things, but yeah, we're not going to save the planet by those individual things. We're going to need a much bigger systemic change that has to be led by corporations, it has to be led by legislation and government. And also, I think that there's a bit of a class issue there as well. Can you guys talk to that a little bit in terms of climate change and the way that, things that are eco-friendly always cost more money? Like, is being personally responsible or personally sustainable, is that like a luxury that only wealthy people can engage in?
Well, I feel like it is definitely more, I guess it's easier for wealthy people to be more like environmentally conscious with everything that they consume and the things that they do. But I also feel like that sort of concept it's almost like it's been turned into an aesthetic. Like, it's not, oh yes, I want to do this to help our earth. It's, I want to do this so that I can almost brag. Like, I feel like a lot of the wealthy people who do that, and then they look down on people with a lower income not being able to do it to their level, they just see it as a sort of medal they can wear rather than caring about the impacts that their actions have on our planet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm kind of in my first time in my life living by myself, kind of taking care of myself. And I've found now that I have to buy my own things and all of that stuff that, the sustainable alternative is often so much more expensive. And I think, that's an issue in and of itself, because we can't make sustainability this like thing that we're trying to attain, but it's only like we're only able to do it if we fall into a certain class bracket. Like, it needs to be accessible for everyone because it's the only option. Like, if we don't kind of do those things, then, we're not going to have an earth to live on at the end of the day. So I think it's so important that we start making like tangible efforts towards sustainability so that it doesn't have to be the expensive option. It's just how we function as a society. So I think, that's super important.
And let's talk about food, because I think that the food industry is a really massive kind of thing that is probably going to change in the future as we develop more sustainable farming practices, as we move away from eating like meat that is grown in fields and not in laboratories, in all sorts of different ways. What do you think the challenges are of food in the future? What do you think that the possibilities are? Like, what are your thoughts about eating in the future? I'm hoping for like those replicators they have on Star Trek, where you can just be like, I want this, and it will just make it for you straight away. I would like one of those in my kitchen at home, please. What do you think?
I haven't really thought much about that. I just think that, well, it's definitely going to be an adjustment.
Yeah.
Obviously. It's going to change the food that we eat. It's going to change the things that we need to survive. But I also think that people might try and sort of stick to what they know now. And I think that it's really important that we make sure that everyone is educated on the impact that the food that you consume has on our planet. And I think it's just important to have a just united understanding that this is the goal that we're aiming for, and these are the steps that we need to do in order to achieve it.
Yeah. Can I ask, is that the kind of thing, have you had any of that kind of stuff at school? Like, have they been talking about climate and food and,
I mean, we talk about climate change, like it's never like a unit. We're talking about climate change, it's just kind of scattered around in lessons where it's relevant. But we don't really discuss like the impact food has on it.
Do you think it would be helpful if there was a unit on that, if it was part of the curriculum?
Yeah, I think we do need to make information on this like more accessible and more obviously just common in our society and in our education system. And I just think it's an important thing for people to understand, because obviously you hear so much about climate change and its impacts and what's happening just from the general media and just the world. But I think a lot of people that, because they're hearing it so loosely and things like that, they just form misconceptions about it and just dismiss it rather than educating themselves on the reality of it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of like, well, that's happening and that seems very bad, but what can I possibly do about it? So I guess I just won't think about it. But of course, there are lots of ways that we can do stuff about it, which is not, buying recycled toilet paper, although we should buy recycled toilet paper, but also through, you know, who we vote for and how we lobby our politicians and our governments and that kind of stuff as well to kind of make that change happen, as well as lobbying corporations to act differently. Zuva, what do you think about food in the future?
Yeah, well, I'm a vegetarian recently, and it is because of climate reasons and, you know, the impact of the agricultural industry on the environment. But so like because of that, I kind of have my eye on like all of that science about, you know, meat that's being grown in laboratories and, you know, all that kind of thing. But I find, and this tends to be the issue when we try to come up with like solutions to certain things, that they create their own new problems. So I saw this research into like, I think it was like making chicken from like cells from feathers of chickens or something like that. And it sounds really good and like a step in the right direction, but then those processes require their own resources that are not necessarily sustainable if they're going to be produced on a mass scale. So I think it's really important that if we are going to build up a better future, that we take the appropriate and like slow steps to actually make sure we're doing it right. And that when we build up these new systems to try and help us, that we're not just creating another issue that we'll just push to the side and then try and deal with in the next 30 years after we've dealt with the issues that we have in front of us. Like, I think if it's actually going to work, it needs to be done in a way that actually considers the long-term effects.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that if they could do that, if they could make meat sustainably in a lab, would you go back to eating it?
I don't know personally, just because I found that I have a bunch of great like veg options, and you know, I really like eating vegetables now. So I don't know that I would, but I definitely wouldn't be as opposed to it as I am now. But also, I just want to mention as well, when it comes to food in the future, I think there's such a cultural weight that food can hold as well. And I think that's another thing as well to consider, is that it might be all good and well to kind of have these sustainable practices, but trying not to lose like the culture that comes with all of those old practices. I think that's really important, because there are so many traditional dishes from so many different places across the world that, you know, might not necessarily have been sustainable in their origins, but if we can acknowledge that and try to reroute that in a way that's kind of compatible with the world that we're entering into, I think that's super important as well.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. The other thing that a lot of people are talking about, one of the things we're talking about going to space, which is something I've been researching lately, is using insect proteins as a sort of really good way of, particularly on long space travel, it's a lot easier to farm crickets than it is to farm sheep on a spaceship. And they provide a lot of protein that is a lot harder to get from vegetable sources. And so, you know, there's a lot of just like eating stir-fried crickets or just grounding them up and making them into a protein powder. How do you guys feel about eating insects?
That would probably be gross, but if it's for the greater good, then I guess I would take that bullet.
Yeah, nice.
It's actually really funny that you bring this up, because I'm going to be traveling with my family in like this month, the end of this month, and I said to my mom that I will be willing to try escargot, even though I'm a vegetarian, because I kind of recognize, you know, insects are definitely a lot easier on the environment than like traditional meat sources. So I definitely wouldn't be opposed to it. There's this thing in Zimbabwe called mopani worms, and like Southern Africa as a whole. I'm from Zimbabwe, by the way, and like, you know, my mom tells me these stories as well of how they used to catch like termites like outside, and they just like fry them up in a pan as like a crunchy snack. And I think that's incredible, and also points to another thing of there are so many sustainable practices that have been, you know, created and cultivated in different cultures. And I think if we sort of destigmatize those things, as a lot of those cultures have been, as not like the Eurocentric standard, if we can kind of look to those and be like, okay, what have they been doing to create a sustainable world and really work with the land? I think that is so important, particularly in Australia. There are a lot of Indigenous practices that are so much more sustainable than what we do now. And if we return to the roots of where we all kind of came from, I think there's a lot of potential that there is there to create sustainability.
Absolutely. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because this is very pertinent. The Future You program that I'm working on in conjunction with the Office for the Ambassador for Women in STEM is a program that is designed to engage young people, particularly girls and non-binary people, in STEM, in science, technology, engineering and mathematics, and to try and encourage them to consider career pathways in STEM, and also to try and dismantle some of the assumptions we have about STEM careers, that they are only for astrophysicists and for very nerdy, smart people, and for high achievers, and that in fact STEM careers are available to everybody. And there are lots of different pathways, not just through high-scoring university programs, but also through TAFE, through apprenticeships. There's lots of different ways to sort of engage in STEM careers. And my part of the program is called Imagining the Future. And so I'm the lead writer on this program, and it is a series of short stories created by myself and 4 other writers who are Beck Lim, Melissa Keel, Gary Lonesborough and Alison Evans. We're all Australian young adult authors, and we have created this sort of shared world. We created a futuristic scenario about the establishment of an outpost on Callisto. And so we are looking into space exploration, and so we have each written a different short story along this timeline, and we are going to be launching a competition next month for people to submit their own stories sort of set in this sort of imagined future world that we've created. But I bring this up now because Gary Lonesborough's story, Gary is an Indigenous author, and his story is all about using his sort of traditional ways of looking after country and applying them to a moon of Jupiter. And it's a really, really beautiful story that he's written about using Indigenous knowledge and using these sort of really, really ancient kind of caring for land techniques and applying them to something in space. And it's a sort of really interesting way of looking at space exploration and looking at using a lot of those, that traditional knowledge that we have all over the world, and that how we care for country, how we care for our planet and for other planets as we move beyond this planet, should never be something that is just constricted to, laboratories. It should be something that's really holistic and something that we all participate in. Anyway, if you were the Prime Minister for one day and you could enact one piece of legislation and it didn't have to go through the Senate or any of that kind of tedious stuff, what's the one thing, the one piece of legislation that you would enact, Charlotte?
I guess I would just make different types of gender non-conforming people and trans people more recognised legally in Australia. Because as a gender fluid person myself, I think it's so important that, especially for trans youth, we understand that there are people like us and that we do have legal protection and that we do have legal rights and we are just recognised legally. Because, in New South Wales in particular, you cannot be legally affirmed as a transgender person unless you get some sort of medical intervention.
Right.
And I just think that that's ridiculous. I have no intention of having any medical surgeries to transition. I was assigned female at birth, but I'm happy with my body and the way that my gender kind of works with it, and I think that no law should define how you identify and how other people see you.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. That's I think you're absolutely right. I think that that's a really important thing, and I think it's something that is changing, not quite fast as we would like it to, but I think that the way we approach particularly gender and hopefully gender roles will change in the future. Hopefully it will change a little faster than it has been so far. What do you think, Suva? What's your one piece of legislation?
I think I would probably change the date of Australia Day and definitely want to open up those conversations that come with that, because I don't think it should just be a symbolic kind of movement. I want it to really kind of move and shift into a world in which Indigenous Australians are really recognised and valued within Australia, because it kind of goes back to what I was saying about acknowledging our history in order to move forward in the future. There are just so many injustices that Black and brown Indigenous people of colour in this nation face that can be rooted in basically what Australia Day, as it now stands on the date that it is, celebrates for some reason. And I just think that that's ridiculous. We've come so far, not far enough, but since then we've come so far in recognising the woes of our past, and I think we need to full on confront it. It's uncomfortable. I too, even not as a white Australian, but just as a migrant, have benefited from the Australia that's been created by colonialism. But that doesn't mean I'm going to celebrate it, and I'm going to acknowledge that it was wrong, and we need to rectify the injustices that were done in the past. So that's probably what I would do.
Great, bring it on. Let's leave the planet momentarily. Do you guys think that humanity has a future beyond the Earth? Should we? Do we?
I think that humanity as a whole is very obsessed with the idea of leaving their mark or staking a claim on absolutely anything they can get their hands on.
Put a flag on it. Got to put a flag on it.
And I think that there's some things that we just need to leave alone. I mean, we can barely take care of our own planet as it is. We need to focus on what we're doing here. And again, it just goes back to that same concept of being obsessed with growth rather than stabilizing what we have right now. I think that we need to focus on our planet and caring for it and healing it instead of going out and trying to find a replacement for what we broke in the first place.
What do you think, Suva?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a process that would need to happen in tandem with, nourishing the planet that we already have, because I do think it represents maybe an opportunity to start again. But if we go into it with that same mindset, like you said, of just trying to label anything and like trying to grow as big as we can, then it's doomed to fail. So I think it's definitely a viable option if we can kind of get the science there, but it's something that we need to be very careful with because it's an opportunity that is very delicate and we need to take very seriously. So.
Yeah, this was something we talked a lot when we were developing our story world, was like we wanted to be creating a future that was full of hope. We wanted to be creating a really positive vision of the future that was full of kindness. And so we wanted to make sure that the earth that our people were leaving, and it's not everybody is leaving, but that is a healing earth, and that we're well on the road to fixing everything, and that the discovery, the impetus for making this new outpost was not one of colonization, because obviously we're very, very sure we didn't want to call it a colony because, colonization has not been great. I mean, obviously it's been great for some people, but I think for humanity as a whole, we can agree that it probably hasn't. And so we wanted it to be very much about celebrating discovery and curiosity, and that I think that space exploration, I've got a list here of things that we have now because of space exploration. So because of the research done in space exploration, we now have improvements in insulin pumps, firefighting equipment, scratch-free lenses, solar cells, water filtration, smoke detection, artificial limbs, CAT scans, baby formula, air purifiers, LASIK, and the dust buster. And so I think that was the thing that we really wanted to focus on, was that really celebrating discovery and curiosity. And, I think curiosity is such an important thing for humanity, and hopefully, by exploring other planets, we will learn more about our own, was kind of the message that we wanted to spend. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about was that there has been a real shift in space exploration over the past decade or so, away from putting humans with flags onto places, and now we're putting robots with like scientific equipment onto things. And so there's been this real shift away from space exploration as a conquering, and more into space exploration as research. And it's also a lot easier to stick a robot on Mars than it is to put a person on Mars, because a robot doesn't have to breathe or eat. And so how do you feel about that? How do you feel about, the Mars rovers and that kind of space exploration that is not so much about humans putting their marks on things, but on us trying to learn from the universe?
I think it's definitely interesting. I think there is a future in it, and I think it can help education and help us learn, because I think as a whole, humanity should just constantly be trying to learn and find out new ways to fix mistakes or to even create new things. And I think that it definitely is something that we can use to make our world better, but I think we do have to be very, very careful about it and not try and do too much too quickly and sort of forget how delicate this is and how careful we need to be when exploring space and other planets.
Yeah, absolutely, because space exploration is super expensive and very resource heavy as well. So I guess it is really about finding that balance.
Yeah, I completely agree pretty much with everything you said.
So when you think of the future, do you feel hope or do you feel despair? Or is it both?
I guess it's both.
Depends on the day for me.
Same.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm hopeful in our new generation. I think it's a lot less, I guess, boxed in
Yeah.
as the last. I think we have a lot of new ideas, but I also think that we can't fix things alone. We need help from the generation that's in power currently, and we're not getting it.
Yeah.
So when I look at our current world and I think of the future, I mostly feel scared of what's to come. I mean, when I was little, I used to think like, oh, what will I leave behind? But I mean, I don't know if there will be much left when I do leave behind something for it. I mean, it's just the climate, it's been so rapid. Like, I feel like a lot of people are in denial about that, but it's definitely an issue that we're running out of time on. And we need help from the people that are currently in power in order to fix it. We can't just leave it for a few more decades for our current generation to just go, okay, finally, we have the reins, we can do something.
Yeah, and I think that denial definitely comes, from a lot of places, but there's also an element of fear of if we actually recognize the urgency of this issue, then we're recognizing that there is a legitimate possibility that we're heading towards a future that we can't control and that we as humans can't be a part of. And so I totally agree with you. I think there's a lot of fear, and as much as there is hope, because there is a lot, young people are pretty incredible, I feel like we do need that support if we want to truly be able to kind of hold on to that hope in the years to come.
And what role, we've talked quite a lot about, about power, about corporations, about governments. What kind of role do you think that science plays in creating that future, in creating those solutions?
I guess just as an educator. I mean, in order to fix our problems, we need to know what they are. We need to know every aspect of them so we can find out a solution that won't cause new problems or new issues or work for a few years and then just crumble. I think that we need to work with science and we need to work with the facts in order to find a solution that's sustainable.
Yep.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's kind of about that knowledge and being able to understand the problems that we're facing so that we're not just kind of putting a Band-Aid over things and actually delving into the root of what's going on and making sure that we're really dealing with it properly. Yeah.
And I think that a lot of the time, the way that we think of science and the way we think of scientists is very, very dispassionate, very logical. We think of Mr. Spock. You guys are too young to know about that. But, or, Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory. Or, we think of scientists as being these just very, very logical people who don't have feelings. Where do you think creativity comes into it? Where do you think passion and creativity comes into the sciences?
Well, I think that's kind of where science becomes accessible to the everyday person. It's about kind of creating things that, they originate in a lab, but then you present them in a creative way to, everyday people, and we're able to implement them in our lives and, work with these solutions. They're not just on this shelf, only accessible to people with a certain amount of knowledge or from a certain background. I think it's so important, and, and making science pretty as well. There are so many scientific discoveries, things like solar panels, all of that stuff that help with the environment, but the creativity is in how do we implement that into the world and, make it work with the landscape, make it beautiful. I've always been interested in architecture for that reason. I think it's such a beautiful blend of science and creativity. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I think a lot of scientific discovery is driven by curiosity. I think that's a very human trait to have. And I think with curiosity comes the question, what can I do with this? What can I do with this information? What can I do with this knowledge? And I guess that's where creativity comes into it, of just, okay, we have these facts, we have this information, now we can find something to do with it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So there was this study that happened in the 60s and 70s where researchers got children to draw a picture of a scientist. It's this really famous study. And they did it over 10 years and they got like hundreds of thousands of drawings of scientists. And less than 1% of those drawings was a picture of something other than a white man. So it was like 99.6% of drawings was a white man in a lab coat. And they redid the study recently, about 10 years ago, and it was now like 60% was a white man in a lab coat. So that's a good change. It's probably not quite where we would want to be. And so my question for you both as young women and non-binary people is, have you felt like the sciences that, you know, STEM as a whole was something that was always open and available to you? Is it something that you ever felt excluded from?
Well, I guess I did have an interest in it, especially when I was younger. I always thought, oh, this is interesting. Like, it just, when I'm like 10 and the only science we do is making slime.
I mean, it's the best part of science.
But I guess as I got older, like probably when I was like year 8, 13, 14, it sort of, that door kind of closed for me, where I would be in a classroom full of boys and girls, and then the teacher would be up there ignoring the hand that I raised, where I would answer a question, but I would just say it a little too quietly because I had been shot down so many times, and then the boy in the row in front of me would just immediately say it and get praise. I just think a lot of the time, I mean, I don't think as a whole the scientific community closes out anyone who isn't a man, but I just think a lot of the time that's still the basis, that's still the main thing we tend to think of when we think of science. We seem to think that's our foundation for it. And I think we need to open more doors for people who don't fit into that box.
Yep, absolutely. Siva?
I think I'm pretty lucky because I grew up in a household very kind of focused around science. My parents are both doctors, and they were always very keen on me learning biology. At the time, I would have said I didn't like it because I'm not very much of a science person myself. But I'm very grateful because there's so much that I've learnt in those classrooms that I was put into that has helped me with just my understanding of the world in general. And like you said, I think there's this very like black and white view of what science is, of being unemotional, very logical, and you kind of notice that there's a very stereotypically masculine traits. And so I think that kind of plays into it as well, of being excluded, not even just in the physical sense of people not paying attention to you or like opening those doors for you, letting you speak, but even just those social elements of, oh, this just doesn't feel like an environment for me. And, you know, I feel like a lot of young boys and men are much more emboldened to be able to speak their mind because they're supported by a society that views them as the ideal scientist versus, you know, people like us who just don't feel as supported by the frameworks in place that kind of, you know, surround STEM as it stands. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So we're going to be joined in a moment by Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith, but before that happens, I've just got a couple of slightly less intense questions for you. One is, what is a future invention that has not been invented yet that you feel like would make your day-to-day life a bit easier?
I guess maybe something that can just put my thoughts right into words.
Nice.
I think that would help with communication a lot. I mean, obviously, you guys have heard me stumble over my words a lot in the past 40 minutes. So I think that would just make life a lot easier.
Yep. That would be very helpful. As an author, I would enjoy that a lot and not have to like tap on it.
Yeah, writing essays would be great. I think probably like a teleportation machine because as someone who's just started buying my own groceries, there have been so many times where I've gotten home, I'm like, yes, I'm so excited to make this recipe, and I've forgotten one thing. There is just one thing that I don't have, and I'm like, I can't go all the way back to the grocery store. I can't. So it would be just great if I could just like teleport there, grab what I need, come back. You know, I also don't have my license, so I could just teleport, see my friends, then like, you know, go home, wouldn't have to worry about anything. I feel like it would make life a lot better.
I love that your initial impulse for a teleportation device is not to go to like Zimbabwe or Paris or anywhere. It's like I need to go to the 7-Eleven.
Yeah.
And if you could change one thing about the world right now in order to make a better future, just one thing, what would it be?
This is gonna sound stupid. Have you ever seen Big Hero 6?
Yeah.
I guess just having Baymax, like
Sure.
just everywhere, just a million different.
He's a real
Baymaxes.
big cuddly robot. Is he a robot? He's
Yeah.
a robot.
He's a
Yeah.
robot.
But he's real cuddly.
I mean, especially in COVID times, I just think that would help.
Yeah, definitely. In COVID times, it would have helped to have had a real big cuddly companion.
Yeah, I mean, a bit of an obvious one, but like just get rid of prejudice. I just wish everyone would see people and not as anything else first, you know? I think it's so important to recognize how we're different and how that creates, you know, a diverse world. But like if people could just, you know, be nice.
Yeah, it would be real nice if we could just turn that one right off. And you have already answered this one because you have Baymax, but Zuva, what futuristic invention from pop culture would you like to see in real life? I want, obviously, a Star Trek replicator.
I think maybe like a hologram, like, you know, like I know those exist, but like really realistic ones where like you would FaceTime someone and they would literally be like right in front of you, like they're basically hanging out with you right there. I think that would be pretty cool.
Yeah, that would definitely be very cool. All right, so we are going to be joined now, I think, by Professor Lisa Harvey Smith, which we're going to like hopefully just magically put up on this screen. While that's happening, I am going to introduce her. Oh, there she is. So Professor Lisa Harvey Smith is an award-winning astrophysicist and author with a talent for making the universe accessible to everyone. She is the Australian Government's Women for STEM ambassador, and she and her team work to remove barriers to the participation of women and girls and non-binary people in science, technology, engineering and mathematics. Thank you so much for joining us, Lisa.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thank you. And you've had such an interesting conversation. It's been great to listen along.
Yes, we've had a very lovely chat. I've had a great time. I'm learning lots of things. So Lisa, can you tell us just a little bit, first of all, about what the role of the Ambassador for Women in STEM is and what kind of work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've been in the role now almost 4 years, and it's kind of, it's a big role because there's a lot wrong with our society. There's a lot to fix and there's a lot to work on regarding inclusion and diversity, you know, in workplaces, in the education system. So really my role is to bring together all the evidence and all the knowledge that we have as people around the barriers that people face in STEM. And I've had a long career myself in STEM as an astrophysicist. And I've certainly experienced, you know, firsthand and certainly secondhand a lot of those barriers. As you get further in your career, you notice more and more the things that the panelists were mentioning, you know, things like women and others not getting heard, not getting their voices heard, not getting held to the same standards as the sort of the dominant culture, I guess. And you know, that is the dominant culture is what I mean in workplaces is really that ideal worker that we talked about, the ideal scientist, you know, someone who has you know, no other interests in their life, is laser focused on just doing their job. And you know, we know that our society is not equal in the terms of who does the unpaid labour at home, who looks after children. You know, predominantly that is women. So we've got this kind of uneven playing field, and we're judging people by very different standards depending on their gender. So there's a lot to look at, a lot to kind of work through and to get workplaces to improve, to get government to do things and legislation that will help us, and to get teachers and parents and carers supporting young people in the right ways so that they have every chance that they want to, you know, that they can to learn STEM skills to get into the workforce of the future and to solve these huge problems that we face.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the genesis of the Future You program? Like, how did it come about and what are its sort of key aims that it's trying to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I've worked a lot with teachers throughout my stint as Women in STEM ambassador, and we've also looked at a lot of research around educational barriers to young people deciding what subjects they want to study, and the barriers they face in schools in particular. And what we find through the research is that young people kind of figure out what kind of careers that they think are associated with their gender or their particular cultural group, for example. And they look at those stereotypes and they decide quite young, maybe aged 8 or below, what kind of jobs that might be suitable for them, that the society would encourage them to do, and that they would feel safe in the workforce, in terms of not being a minority in the workforce. So that age is around primary school age. So we're in Future You, we're trying to show young people that STEM skills are really important for everyone, that they're used in all types of different careers. But also, if you do want to pursue a STEM career, something like be an engineer or develop technology, start your own business, be a scientist, a researcher, that those careers are for everyone. But it's really important in tandem, as well as just showing young people that there are career paths out there for them. We're also working with businesses and teachers as well as schools to try and improve the environment. So it's kind of a two-pronged approach to make sure that young people are supported in their choices, but also when they get into STEM studies or workplaces, that they feel safe and supported when they get there too.
Yep, absolutely. And why is diversity so important to this program? Like, what role does diversity play in sort of creating this amazing future workforce?
Well, diversity, it's not a buzzword. It really is proven to, if you care about this stuff, if you're talking to a politician or a business person, it's proven to improve business outcomes. Like, diverse businesses are more profitable. They come up with better solutions. And in terms of what's important for society, we've got some really massive challenges, as the panelists said, with climate change. It's our number one existential threat to the human, people. Basically, all of us have to tackle this with one mind and one heart. And some of those things that we need to do are things, sensible things like stop burning fossil fuels, right? And other things will be to decarbonize the economy. We'll need to develop technologies to help us to do that as well. So those technologies and the technologies we use every day for medicine, to help us communicate, to travel, all those things that humans like to do, they require, STEM skills. And what we've seen in the past is that, for example, the development of things like Facebook and Instagram and other social media and software and the internet, all those things have been developed over the past 20 to 25 years. And most of the people developing those technologies have been like white dude bros in California. And that leads to some real issues when it comes to usability, and things like artificial intelligence and machine learning learns our bad habits as humans and our prejudices. It kind of perpetuates those things. So it's really important that we have a diverse range of people working on technologies so that we can serve all of humanity. A woman from Africa will not have the same life experience and knowledge base as a 25-year-old guy in California developing technology. And a person with disability will not have the same uses for that technology as a person who doesn't have a disability currently. So, again, you've got to have that diversity to see the possibilities of technology, to see the barriers people face. And, there are just so many reasons why diversity is important, especially in STEM, because STEM's a very powerful kind of gateway to, the ways that we change our future.
Absolutely. So in the Future You program, I've spoken a little bit about my part of it, the short stories that me and the other writers have written, which will be available soon. My story is the first one. It will be rolling out in the next couple of weeks. Each story is going to be published digitally, but also with a podcast version that's beautifully acted and produced and has a soundtrack. My particular story features a pop song, and some very clever person has gone away and written and recorded the pop song. It's very exciting. And there's lots of illustrations and stuff as well that can be used in the classroom. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the other approaches that the program is taking to speak to kids?
Absolutely. So as well as the wonderful Imagining the Future short stories and those amazing imaginings of what the future might be like and how technology plays a role in that. We've also got some role models. At the moment, we've got 4 amazing short films featuring these diverse women working in STEM roles in Australia, 2 of them First Nations women, doing incredible things to sort of meld traditional knowledges and science with modern technology, for example. And we've got people like Louise as a party who has gone through vocational pathways and learnt a trade. So we're not just focusing on people who work in science, technology. We're also looking at trades, and all those things use STEM skills. So different kids who have different interests, different levels of academic interest, people who like working with their hands, they'll get to see these diverse role models. And the idea is that we keep adding new role models so that people can see. They'll mainly be women and non-binary folks, but we might chuck some men in there as well to showcase some different types of science and technology. And as well as that, we've got really exciting stuff like competitions. So we want young people not just to watch films, but also then we've got careers resources, teachers packs, so teachers can actually use a curriculum-linked lesson plan and go through the resources. The students can look at their sort of comprehension of the films and ask questions about the types of career paths that they could take. And we find that this is really, again, supported by evidence. There was a survey of teachers done last year by the federal government, and it just showed how many teachers, especially at primary level, didn't feel that they had the right tools and knowledge to explain a lot of STEM careers and these kind of futuristic careers that we're talking about. So to support students and teachers and parents and carers, we've created all these resources. The competitions will be things like writing, creative writing. So we're trying to do a kind of a cross-curricular approach. So we're not just saying, let's just focus on STEM learning. It's really about STEM careers and imagining this brighter future. It's very exciting.
It is very exciting. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you giving us your time and telling us a little bit about the program. People who are interested in Future You can go to futureyouaustralia.com. The website is now live. It just went up the day before yesterday, so it is brand spanking new and we'll be rolling out a lot of new stuff. But now we are going to turn back to our young people, and we've got a little bit of time left for questions from the audience, so you guys here in person and also if we're getting any online as well. So hopefully you've been thinking very, very hard about your questions and we are now very ready to hear them. How are we going? Yes.
I'd like to ask, with what you were saying about scientists, I find one of the things that are still not diverse, I come from a healthcare background which really is very diverse, is the media. And, Australian shows still have the tokenism of the one Asian person or the one Indigenous person or the one African person in it. What would you say to the media to make them realise that they really need to change their casting and how they do things?
I guess just try to dismantle prejudice, because what you said with tokenism, I think a lot of the time they don't really see it as, oh yes, this is a talented person who can play the role well. They see it as, okay, I'm ticking off a box here, and then no one can say that I've not included a community. And I think that they need to get out of that mindset and just view everyone as who they are, I guess, instead of just viewing them as, okay, that's gonna stop me from looking like a bigot.
I totally agree. I think it's so easy for them, to get one person and be like, just clap give themselves a clap, give themselves a pat on the back, be like, yep, I did it, it's great. And I think representation is very important, but it cannot be tokenistic, because it also creates this thing when you have, oh, well, I have my one spokesperson who's not like the status quo. This sense of competition within people of the same cultural background, whatever it might be, where they think, oh, like, I'm only going to get this one opportunity. If someone else of my background gets it, then that's it for me. And I just think that's so unfair when you have so many talented people who, you know, all fall outside the status quo, all fall from different cultural, political backgrounds, whatever it might be. I think it's so important to like give people a chance to be able to say what they want to say without like making them feel like they're competing for the attention, because it's supposed to be limited in some capacity.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing your stories today. Very personal ones. It's been great to hear from you. I was wondering about if you could comment on the sort of the power of fiction in terms of changing behaviour for children. So are there books that you've read when you were younger or now that really have made you change your behaviour or change how you think or normalise behaviours? I'm just trying to think of, what do you think that books about diverse people doing things to save the world, what impact that might have on children?
I think it might allow a lot of young kids to see themselves represented in a lot of areas where they haven't been before. Personally, I never really read those sorts of books until I got a bit older and I started reading stories about heroes who could be people who weren't just the random white teenage character. And I think that it's important to have those stories that are not centered around that, and to have different people of different cultures and sexualities and genders represented. And I think that can impact not only kids' self-esteem, but also understanding of others.
I think it's also very important in fiction to kind of, you know, culture and identity is such a big part of it, but then a lot of the time you see the only stories that get published are the ones that solely focus on the individual's like identity and like their struggles with it and the hardship. But, you know, we want to see stories of people thriving and just living their lives and not having to constantly be reminded of their race or sexuality or whatever it might be. I think that's also a big part of making young people feel emboldened to be able to go out in the world and make change and not feel like they're constantly going to have their identity thrown back in their face. So,
How else are we going? All right, we are out of time. So we're going to wrap it up there. Charlotte and Zuba, thank you so much for joining me up here tonight and sharing your thoughts and your experiences and your hopes for the future. I think you've both been just incredibly honest with us, and it's a real gift to be able to hear such intelligent young voices, and I'm sure that everybody else agrees with me. So thank you so much, and thank you everybody who's come along tonight, and I hope that we will all spend some time thinking about how we are going to build a better future together. Thanks very much.